The autumn wind howled through Blackwood Forest as 5 college friends stood at the trailhead, their breath visible in the crisp October air. Halloween night had always been their tradition. Find the scariest local legend and test their courage against it. Are you sure about this? Maya asked, adjusting her backpack nervously. The park ranger said this trail's been closed for maintenance. That's exactly why it's perfect, Jake grinned, shouldering his hiking gear. No crowds, no distractions. Just us and whatever's out there. The trail began innocuously enough, marked by weathered wooden signs that creaked in the wind. But after 20 minutes of hiking, they encountered the first lantern, an old-fashioned oil lamp hanging from a low branch, its flame flickering but somehow never extinguishing despite the breeze. That's weird, Sam muttered, pointing his flashlight at the rustic fixture. Who maintains these things out here? Probably some historical society thing, replied Emma, though her voice carried uncertainty. Come on, it's actually kind of atmospheric. They continued deeper into the forest, following what seemed to be a well-marked path illuminated by more lanterns strung between the trees. Each one cast dancing shadows that made the surrounding woods seem alive with movement. The friends joked and laughed, their voices echoing off the towering pines. But gradually their conversation died as they noticed something disturbing. Guys, Maya whispered, stopping abruptly. Look behind us. They turned to see complete darkness where they'd just walked. Every lantern they'd passed had gone out, leaving nothing but an impenetrable wall of black forest. That's impossible, Jake said, his bravado wavering. Lanterns don't just turn off by themselves. Maybe they're on some kind of timer, Emma suggested weakly. Tom pulled out his phone to check their GPS location, but the screen showed only static. No signal. And according to this, we're not even on a trail anymore. The remaining lanterns ahead flickered ominously, as if responding to his words. The path stretched onward, disappearing into the dense woodland that seemed to press closer with each step. We should go back, Maya said, her voice rising with panic. We can't, Sam replied grimly, shining his flashlight into the darkness behind them. There's no path anymore. It's like the forest swallowed it. With no choice but to continue forward, they pressed on. The lanterns grew more frequent, forming almost a tunnel of dancing light through the trees. But something else was wrong. The ground beneath their feet had changed from packed dirt to soft, muddy earth that squelched with each step. It was Tom who first noticed the footprints. Jesus Christ, he breathed, crouching down to examine the mud. These aren't ours. In the soft earth around their feet were dozens of other boot prints, sneaker treads, and bare footprints. Some looked fresh, the edges still sharp and clear. Others seemed older, but not by much. How many people have walked this path? Emma whispered. More importantly, Jake said, his voice tight with fear. Where are they now? The final lantern appeared ahead, larger and brighter than the others, hanging over what looked like a clearing. As they approached, they could see the warm glow of a campfire beyond the tree line. The sight should have been comforting, but something about the scene felt deeply wrong. They emerged into a circular clearing where a large fire crackled in the center. Around it, perhaps 20 people sat in a perfect circle, men, women, teenagers, even a few children. All were dressed in hiking gear, their backpacks and equipment scattered around them as if they'd been camping for days. Thank God, Maya sobbed with relief. Other people. Maybe they can help us get out of here. But as they approached the fire, the seated figures didn't acknowledge them. They stared straight ahead into the flames, their eyes reflecting the light like mirrors. Their faces were peaceful, almost serene, but completely motionless. Excuse me, Jake called out. Are you all right? We're kind of lost and... His words died in his throat as every single person around the fire slowly turned their head toward him in perfect unison. Their movements were mechanical, unnatural, like marionettes being controlled by the same invisible hand. The nearest figure, a middle-aged man in a REI jacket, opened his mouth, and a whispered voice emerged that seemed to come from all of them at once. Join us by the fire. We've been waiting, said a woman in hiking boots, her lips barely moving. So long, whispered a teenage boy, his eyes never blinking. Join us, they all repeated together, their voices creating a horrible harmony. Join us by the fire. The friends backed away in terror, but behind them, the lanterns they'd followed began to flicker back to life, one by one, creating a new path deeper into the forest. "No," Maya whispered. "No, we're not doing this." But even as she spoke, she felt her feet moving toward the fire, drawn by some invisible force. Around her, her friends were walking forward too, their faces beginning to take on the same peaceful, vacant expression as the others. "Join us by the fire," Tom heard himself say, though he hadn't meant to speak. The last thing he remembered was the warmth of the flames on his face and the sound of his own voice joining the others in their eternal invitation, calling out to whatever group of lost hikers would next follow the lantern path to Blackwood Forest. Park Ranger Sarah McKenna had seen her share of vandalism over the years. Graffiti on trail signs, initials carved into observation deck railings, the occasional campfire ring left in unauthorized areas. But the faces appearing throughout Millbrook Forest were something entirely different. It started with a single carving on an old oak tree near the visitor center. Someone had used a knife to cut a crude face into the bark, hollow circles for eyes, a gaping slash for a mouth. The technique was amateur, but there was something unsettling about the expression, a quality that made visitors uncomfortable enough to complain. "Probably kids," her supervisor had said dismissively. "Fill out a vandalism report and keep an eye out." But the next morning, Sarah found 3 more faces carved into trees along the main hiking trail. By the end of the week, there were dozens scattered throughout the forest, each one slightly different but sharing the same disturbing features: empty eyes and screaming mouths. The faces seemed to follow a pattern, appearing deeper in the forest each night. Sarah began documenting them with her camera, creating a map of their locations. Whatever was creating them was moving systematically through the woods, working their way toward the forest's remote interior. Security cameras captured nothing useful, just empty forest scenes with normal night sounds. But every morning brought new carvings, and Sarah noticed they were getting more detailed, more realistic. The crude slashes had evolved into carefully carved features with an almost artistic quality. On Halloween night, Sarah decided she'd had enough. Armed with a flashlight, pepper spray, and her radio, she ventured into the forest alone, determined to catch the vandal in the act. Following the trail of carved faces like grotesque breadcrumbs, she hiked deeper into Millbrook Forest than she'd ever gone alone at night. The faces seemed to watch her pass, their empty sockets tracking her movement in the shifting beam of her flashlight. After an hour of hiking, the trail led her to a massive oak tree that stood at the forest's heart, an ancient giant that must have been growing for centuries. But this tree was different. Every inch of its bark was covered in carved faces, hundreds of them crowded together like a twisted gallery of portraits. "My God," Sarah whispered, running her light over the incredible display. That's when she heard the scraping sound. Hidden behind the great oak, a figure worked frantically with a hunting knife, carving yet another face into the bark. In the glow of Sarah's flashlight, she could see it was a man, but his appearance made her stomach lurch. His face was horribly disfigured, covered in deep scars and cuts that formed the same pattern as the carved faces. Hollow pits where his eyes should be, a gaping wound for a mouth. His clothes were tattered and filthy, suggesting he'd been living in the woods for a very long time. "Sir," Sarah called out, her hand moving to her radio. "I'm going to need you to drop the knife and step away from the tree." The man stopped carving and slowly turned toward her. When he spoke, his voice was a raspy whisper that seemed to come from somewhere other than his ruined mouth. "Can't stop," he said. "They're hungry. Always hungry." "Who's hungry?" Sarah asked, keeping her distance. "Sir, you're under arrest for vandalism of public property. I need you to come with me." The man laughed, a sound like wind through broken glass. "You don't understand. These aren't just carvings, they're windows. Each one holds someone who got too close, asked too many questions." As he spoke, Sarah noticed something that made her blood freeze. The carved faces on the tree were moving slightly, their hollow eyes blinking, their mouths opening and closing as if trying to speak. "That's impossible," she breathed. "I was like you once," the man continued, approaching her slowly. "Park Ranger Forest Service. Found him living out here 20 years ago, thought I could help. But he showed me the truth, showed me how to feed the tree, how to give it what it wants." The faces were definitely moving now, their expressions shifting from blank emptiness to desperate pleading. Sarah could hear faint whispers coming from the bark itself, voices calling for help, begging to be freed. "Every face contains a soul," the man explained, raising his knife. "Everyone who comes looking, everyone who gets too close. The tree preserves them, keeps them alive but trapped, and it's always hungry for more." Sarah fumbled for her pepper spray, but the man was faster than his appearance suggested. He lunged forward, pinning her against the massive trunk. "Don't worry," he whispered as the knife approached her face. "It doesn't hurt for long, and you'll have plenty of company." The last thing Sarah saw before the blade touched her skin was her own reflection in the polished metal, and behind it, hundreds of carved faces watching from the bark, their mouths open in silent screams of warning that had come too late. The next morning, hikers would find Sarah's abandoned truck in the parking lot and her radio crackling with unanswered calls. Search teams would scour the forest for days, but they would never find her body. They would, however, discover a new face carved into the ancient oak at the forest's heart. A face with Sarah's features, her eyes wide with eternal terror, her mouth open in a scream that would never end. And deep in the woods, the disfigured man continued his work, adding face after face to his collection, feeding the hungry tree that had claimed him decades ago and would continue claiming visitors for decades to come. Marcus Thompson had only been working at Hartwell Marketing for 3 weeks, so when his new co-workers invited him to their annual Halloween team building event, he jumped at the chance to fit in. The company prided itself on unconventional approaches to corporate bonding, and a nighttime scavenger hunt through Raven's Hollow Forest sounded like exactly the kind of quirky activity that had attracted him to the job. "It's tradition," explained Jennifer from HR, handing him a sealed envelope and a high-end walkie-talkie. "Every Halloween, we split into teams and see who can collect all the items on their list before dawn. Winner gets a week of paid vacation." Marcus looked around at his 11 colleagues, all dressed in hiking gear and carrying backpacks filled with supplies. They seemed genuinely excited about the event, sharing stories of previous year's hunts and comparing the equipment they'd brought. "The rules are simple," announced Dave, their team leader and the event's organizer. "Don't open your envelopes until you're at your assigned starting position. Collect every item on your list, radio in when you find something, and return to the parking lot before sunrise. Easy enough, right?" The group split up, each person heading to a different trailhead marked with glow sticks. Marcus's assignment took him to the forest's eastern edge, where an old logging road disappeared into the darkness between towering pine trees. At exactly midnight, he opened his envelope and read the list by flashlight. Item 1, a white stone from the creek bed. Item 2, 3 pine cones from different species of tree. Item 3, a feather from a night bird. Item 4, a dead branch shaped like a letter. Item 5, a piece of birch bark at least 6 inches long. The first few items seemed straightforward enough. Marcus found the creek within 20 minutes and selected a smooth white stone from the shallow water. The pine cones took longer, but his biology degree helped him identify different species in the beam of his flashlight. "Marcus here," he radioed in. "Got the first 3 items. How's everyone else doing?" Static crackled back at him, followed by Jennifer's voice. "Great job. I'm still looking for my second item. This is harder than I thought." But as Marcus continued deeper into the forest, searching for the remaining items on his list, he noticed his colleague's radio chatter was becoming increasingly frantic. "I can't find the trail back," came Dave's voice, tight with concern. "My GPS isn't working and these trees all look the same." "Something's following me," whispered Sarah from accounting. "I keep hearing footsteps, but when I shine my light around, there's nothing there." Marcus found a suitable piece of birch bark and was searching for a dead branch when he heard the first scream. It was brief but unmistakably human, a cry of pure terror that echoed through the forest before cutting off abruptly. Marcus froze, his blood turning to ice. "Did everyone hear that?" he called into his radio. Someone just screamed. "Who was that?" Silence. "Hello? Can anyone respond? Jennifer? Dave? Sarah?" More silence, broken only by the occasional burst of static. Marcus tried different channels but got no response from any of his coworkers. Fighting down panic, he decided to head back toward the parking lot. But when he tried to retrace his steps, the trail seemed to have vanished. The forest that had felt navigable earlier now seemed like an impenetrable maze of identical trees and overgrown paths. That's when he found the first backpack. Was Dave's. Marcus recognized the expensive hiking pack, their team leader had been so proud of, but it was abandoned in the middle of what looked like a struggle, its contents scattered across the forest floor. Dave's flashlight lay broken nearby, its lens cracked and dark. A few hundred yards further, Marcus discovered Jennifer's walkie-talkie smashed against a tree trunk. Then Sarah's hiking boots, sitting empty beside a fallen log as if she'd simply vanished out of them. The horrible truth began to dawn on him as he found more evidence of his colleagues' presence. Torn clothing caught on branches, scattered personal items, drops of blood on fallen leaves. They hadn't simply gotten lost. Something had happened to them. Something bad. Marcus tried to convince himself there was a rational explanation, but deep down he knew better. The scavenger hunt hadn't been a team-building exercise. It had been something else entirely, a way to separate the group and make them vulnerable. He pulled out his list again, hands shaking as he read the items in the dim glow of his failing flashlight. But the words had changed. Where before there had been simple requests for natural objects, now he saw Item 4, a memento from someone who trusted you. Item 5, evidence of a colleague's final moments. Item 6, something that once belonged to someone who's never coming home. The paper felt different too, older, rougher, as if it had been written long ago. Marcus realized with growing horror that everyone's list must have transformed, leading them deeper into the forest with increasingly dark requests. A branch snapped behind him, and Marcus spun around to see a pair of yellow eyes reflecting his flashlight beam. Then another pair, and another. They weren't animal eyes. They were too large, too intelligent, and they were positioned at human height among the trees. Whatever was watching him moved with deliberate patience, staying just outside the reach of his light. Marcus ran. He crashed through underbrush and stumbled over fallen logs, his flashlight beam dancing wildly as he fled. Behind him, he could hear pursuit, not the heavy footfalls of a large predator, but something worse. The sound of multiple somethings moving through the forest with inhuman coordination. As he ran, Marcus understood that Dave hadn't organized any scavenger hunt. Dave was as much a victim as the rest of them. Someone or something else had orchestrated this night, luring them into the forest with promises of harmless fun. The items on their lists had been bait, designed to lead them away from safety and into the dark heart of Raven's Hollow Forest, where something patient and hungry waited for its annual Halloween feast. Marcus's flashlight died as he stumbled into a clearing, leaving him in complete darkness. Around him, he could hear the whisper of movement as his pursuers closed in. In the faint moonlight filtering through the canopy, he caught glimpses of pale shapes emerging from between the trees. His radio crackled one final time with a message that chilled him to the bone. It was his own voice, calm and measured as if he were reading from a script. Marcus here. Found all my items. The hunt is over. Time to come home. But Marcus hadn't spoken those words, and as the pale figures reached for him with elongated fingers, he realized someone else would be using his voice next Halloween to lure another group of unsuspecting colleagues into Raven's Hollow Forest. The hunt would continue, year after year, and there would always be more prey willing to follow the promise of harmless fun into the darkness. Jake Morrison and Emma Chen had been urban exploring together for 3 years, documenting abandoned buildings and forgotten places throughout the Pacific Northwest. Their YouTube channel, Lost Spaces, had gained a modest following among people fascinated by the stories hidden in derelict structures. Thornfield Forest wasn't their usual target. They typically focused on man-made ruins rather than natural areas. But a local historian had mentioned rumors of old homesteads deep in the woods, settlers' cabins that had been abandoned decades ago and reclaimed by the forest. Halloween episode, Jake had said, adjusting his camera equipment. Spooky forest, mysterious ruins, perfect seasonal content. They'd been hiking for 2 hours when Emma spotted the depression in the ground, a rectangular outline barely visible beneath. Decades of fallen leaves and moss growth. That's not natural, she observed, brushing away debris with her boot. Look at the edges. They're too straight, too uniform. Jake focused his camera on the area as Emma continued clearing away forest litter. Gradually, the outline of stone walls emerged, forming what looked like the entrance to an underground structure. It's a root cellar, Jake said excitedly. Settlers used to build these for food storage. This could be from the 1800s. The entrance had been sealed with a heavy wooden door that had warped and rotted over the years. It took both of them working together to pry it open, revealing stone steps descending into darkness. "Should we really be doing this?" Emma asked, peering into the black opening. "I mean, structurally, this thing could collapse." "That's what makes it interesting," Jake replied, switching on his powerful LED headlamp. "Besides, look at those stone walls." This thing was built to last. The steps were solid, carved from the same stone as the walls. As they descended, their lights revealed a surprisingly large underground chamber, with shelves carved directly into the rock walls. The air was cool and still, carrying a faint, musty odor that spoke of decades of undisturbed isolation. "This is incredible," Emma breathed, running her camera along the walls. "The preservation is amazing. Look, there are still things on the shelves." Jake focused his light on the stone shelves that lined the cellar. They were filled with dozens of mason jars, their metal lids green with corrosion but still intact. The glass containers held various substances. Some appeared to contain preserved vegetables floating in cloudy brine. Others held darker liquids that were impossible to identify. "Pickled vegetables?" "Probably," Jake said, lifting one jar to examine it closer. "Maybe fruit preserves." People stored everything they could for winter. But Emma had moved deeper into the cellar and made a discovery that made her stomach clench. "Jake," she called out, her voice tight with concern. "You need to see this." She was standing before a shelf of jars that contained something other than vegetables. Floating in the murky liquid were dozens of human teeth, molars, incisors, canines, all perfectly preserved but unmistakably human. That's not normal food preservation," Jake said, his enthusiasm rapidly fading. They moved their lights along more shelves, finding jars containing what looked like human hair, fingernails, and other organic matter they didn't want to examine too closely. The root cellar clearly hadn't been used for storing food, at least not the kind normal people ate. "We should go," Emma said, backing toward the stairs. "This feels wrong, really wrong." But Jake had discovered something else, an opening at the back of the cellar that led to a tunnel extending deeper underground. Look at this. The cellar's bigger than we thought. There's a whole network down here." Against her better judgment, Emma followed him into the tunnel. Their lights revealed that the underground structure was far more extensive than a simple root cellar should be. Passages branched off in multiple directions, some sloping downward into deeper darkness. The tunnel walls were lined with more shelves, more jars, but these contained fresher specimens. The liquid was clearer, the organic matter more recently preserved. Emma noticed modern elements mixed in with the old, plastic containers, contemporary camping equipment, even a cell phone in a waterproof bag. "Someone's been using this place recently," she whispered. That's when they found the missing person flyers. They were tacked to a wooden support beam, dozens of them featuring faces Emma recognized from local news reports. Young hikers who had vanished in the area over the past few years, their smiling photos staring out from missing posters that someone had carefully collected and displayed like trophies. "Holy shit," Jake breathed. "We need to call the police. Right now." A sound echoed from deeper in the tunnel system, a wet sliding noise accompanied by labored breathing. Something was moving in the darkness beyond their lights, something that sounded large and definitely alive. Emma grabbed Jake's arm. "Run! Now!" They fled through the tunnels, their lights bouncing wildly as they ran. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder, not footsteps, but something dragging itself across the stone floor with horrible determination. Jake caught a glimpse of their pursuer in his peripheral vision, something pale and humanoid, but wrong, moving on all fours with elongated limbs that seemed to bend in ways human joints shouldn't allow. They burst out of the root cellar into the forest, gasping and stumbling over roots in their panic to get away. Emma fumbled for her phone, trying to get a signal to call for help, while Jake gathered their equipment with shaking hands. "Did you get the location?" Emma asked breathlessly. "GPS coordinates. Anything?" Jake checked his camera's GPS log and found the coordinates. But when Emma tried to explain their discovery to the 911 dispatcher, her story sounded increasingly frantic and unbelievable. The police search team arrived 3 hours later, led by Emma and Jake back to the spot where they'd found the root cellar. But when they reached the location, there was nothing there, just undisturbed forest floor covered with decades of fallen leaves. It was right here, Jake insisted, dropping to his knees and digging through the leaf litter. The stone outline, the entrance, everything was right here. The officers were polite but skeptical. After an hour of searching the area with metal detectors and ground-penetrating equipment, they found no evidence that any structure had ever existed at that location. Emma and Jake were left standing in the forest, staring at a patch of ground that looked exactly like every other patch of forest floor, wondering if they'd somehow imagined the entire experience. But that night, safe in their respective homes, both of them dreamed of pale figures moving through underground tunnels, tending to collections of preserved human specimens, waiting patiently for the next group of explorers to stumble upon their hidden domain. And somewhere in the depths of Thornfield Forest, in passages that existed only when they chose to be found, mason jars filled with fresh specimens were being carefully labeled and arranged on stone shelves, ready to join a collection that had been growing for far longer than anyone suspected. The Hartman family's annual camping trip to Shadow Pine Forest had been a tradition for 6 years running. Every Halloween weekend, they'd pack up their RV and spend 3 days in the wilderness, enjoying what Linda called quality family time, away from screens and schedules. This year felt different from the start. 8-year-old Tommy had been unusually quiet during the drive, staring out the window at the darkening forest with an intensity that worried his parents. His 12-year-old sister Ashley noticed it too, but dismissed it as Tommy being Tommy. He'd always been the dreamy, imaginative one. They set up camp in their usual spot, a clearing beside Shadow Pine Creek where the sound of running water would mask the noise of nearby campsites. But this Halloween weekend, they were the only family in the area. The campground host mentioned that several reservations had been canceled due to unusual wildlife activity. What kind of wildlife activity? Linda asked nervously. Oh, probably nothing serious, the host replied with forced casualness. Some hikers reported strange sounds, animals behaving oddly. Fish and Game looked into it but didn't find anything concerning. That first evening, as the family sat around their campfire roasting marshmallows, Tommy began his echo game. "Hello, Forest," he called out toward the tree line. After a moment, his voice bounced back. "Hello, Forest." Tommy giggled with delight. "Did you hear that?" "It answered me." "That's called an echo, buddy," his father Mark explained. "Sound waves bounce off the trees and come back to us. It's physics, not magic." But Tommy was already calling out again. "What's your name?" The echo returned as expected. "What's your name?" Ashley rolled her eyes at her little brother's antics, but their parents smiled indulgently. Tommy had always been fascinated by natural phenomena, and echo games were harmless fun. Over the next hour, Tommy continued his conversation with the forest, asking questions and giggling at the responses. But gradually, his parents began to notice something odd about the echoes. They seemed to be coming back faster than they should, and from different directions. "Are you having fun?" Tommy called out. The response came back almost immediately, but it wasn't quite Tommy's voice. "Are you having fun?" The tone was similar, but deeper, with an accent none of them could identify. Linda glanced at Mark with concern. "Tommy, honey, maybe it's time to come inside the RV," she suggested. "But the forest is talking to me," Tommy protested. "It's been waiting for someone to play with." That night, Tommy's parents were awakened by the sound of their son's voice outside the RV. Through the window, they could see him standing in the clearing, apparently having a conversation with someone they couldn't see. "Who are you talking to, sweetheart?" Linda called out softly. "My new friend," Tommy replied without turning around. "He sounds just like me, but he's been here much longer." Mark stepped outside, flashlight in hand, and confirmed that Tommy was alone in the clearing. But as he listened, he could clearly hear two voices engaged in conversation. Tommy's high, childish tones, and something else that was almost identical but carried an undertone of age and weariness that no 8-year-old should possess. "Tommy, come back inside," Mark said firmly. The boy turned around, and in the flashlight beam, Mark could see that Tommy's expression was strange, too knowing, too adult for his young face. "He wants to play more games tomorrow," Tommy said. "He's been lonely for so long." The second day brought more concerning behavior. Tommy would disappear for hours, claiming he was playing with his echo friend deeper in the forest. When Ashley tried to follow him, she discovered something that made her blood run cold. Tommy was standing in a grove of pine trees, having what sounded like a normal conversation. But Ashley could hear both sides of the dialogue, and they weren't echoes anymore. Two distinct voices were speaking, Tommy's familiar tones, and something else that sounded like Tommy but wasn't quite right. "I like your family," the other voice was saying. "They seem nice. Do you think they'd like to stay here with us?" "I don't know," Tommy replied thoughtfully. "They usually like to go home after the weekend." "Home is overrated," the voice continued. "Here in the forest, you never have to grow up. You never have to leave your friends behind." Ashley backed away quietly, her heart pounding. When she told her parents what she'd overheard, they decided to cut the camping trip short. But that night, Tommy vanished. The family searched frantically, calling his name throughout the campground. Mark contacted the ranger station while Linda and Ashley combed the forest with flashlights, following Tommy's voice as it called back to them from deeper in the woods. "I'm here," they heard him shout. "Come find me." But the voice seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously, leading them in circles through the darkening forest. Sometimes it sounded like Tommy, sometimes like the other voice Ashley had heard, and sometimes like both speaking in unison. After 3 hours of fruitless searching, they found Tommy standing in the clearing where they'd first made camp, perfectly unharmed but somehow changed. He smiled at them with an expression that seemed too old for his face, and when he spoke, his words carried an odd echo even though they were in the open air. "I'm back," he said, but the words seemed to come from two sources at once. Tommy's mouth, and somewhere else entirely. Linda embraced her son, tears of relief streaming down her face, but Mark noticed something that chilled him. Tommy's echo was coming before he finished speaking, as if the forest was anticipating his words and responding to thoughts rather than sounds. As they packed up to leave the next morning, Tommy stood at the edge of the clearing, apparently saying goodbye to his invisible friend. But Mark could hear both sides of the conversation clearly now, and what he heard made him understand that whatever had happened to his son, Tommy hadn't returned to them alone. "Don't worry," Tommy was saying. "I'll bring them back to visit soon." "And next time," replied the voice that wasn't quite Tommy's, "maybe they'll want to stay forever." As they drove away from Shadow Pine Forest, Mark watched his son in the rearview mirror. Tommy was smiling and waving at the trees, but his reflection in the window showed a different expression entirely, something ancient and hungry that had learned to wear an 8-year-old's face. And from deep in the forest, too distant for human ears to hear, Tommy's real voice echoed faintly from somewhere far beneath the forest floor, calling for help that would never come, calling for help that would never come. Maria Santos had been hiking alone for 15 years, ever since her grandfather had given her his antique brass compass and taught her to read the forest like a familiar book. The compass had never failed her, through whiteout conditions in the Cascades, dense fog along the coast, and moonless nights when her flashlight died. Halloween night in Mistwood Forest should have been routine. Maria knew these trails better than her own neighborhood streets, had hiked them in every season and weather condition. The antique compass was more of a sentimental comfort than a necessity on such familiar ground. But 20 minutes into her hike, the compass needle began spinning wildly, pivoting in complete circles as if it couldn't locate magnetic north. Maria tapped the glass face, thinking moisture might have gotten inside, but the spinning only intensified. She pulled out her phone to check her GPS position, but the screen showed her location as a blank gray area with no topographical features. According to the digital map, she was standing in the middle of nowhere. Technology, Maria muttered, trusting her grandfather's wisdom over modern gadgets. She'd navigate by landmarks the way hikers had for centuries before satellites and GPS. But the forest seemed different tonight. Familiar trails led to dead ends she'd never encountered before. A switchback that should have taken her to Boulder Creek instead ended at a steep cliff she'd never seen. Even the trees looked wrong, too tall, too closely spaced, their branches forming canopies that blocked out more starlight than they should. The compass continued its erratic behavior for another hour before finally settling, its needle pointing steadily in one direction that didn't match any of Maria's reference points. According to her knowledge of the area, the compass was directing her toward the dense, unmarked wilderness at Mistwood's heart, territory she'd always avoided because it lacked maintained trails. Against her better judgment, Maria followed the compass bearing. Her grandfather had always told her to trust the instrument when all else failed, and tonight everything else certainly was failing. The needle led her through increasingly difficult terrain, over fallen logs, around massive boulders, through dense undergrowth that seemed untouched by human passage. But despite the rough going, Maria found herself on what appeared to be a faint path, as if others had followed this same route before her. After another hour of hiking, she began to notice other compasses hanging from tree branches like macabre Christmas ornaments. At first, she thought her eyes were playing tricks on her, but as she stopped to investigate, she found dozens of them, antique brass instruments similar to her grandfather's, modern digital compasses, even simple orienteering compasses that looked like they'd belonged to Boy Scout troops. Every single compass needle pointed in the same direction, deeper into the wilderness, toward whatever lay at the center of this strange collection. Maria's rational mind told her to turn back, but her grandfather's compass was growing warm in her hand, almost vibrating with intensity as it pulled her forward. The path became more defined as she walked, worn smooth by the passage of many feet over many years. The hanging compasses grew more numerous, creating a tunnel of gleaming metal instruments that caught her flashlight beam and reflected it in dozens of directions. Some looked ancient, their brass green with patina. Others appeared modern, their digital displays dark and lifeless. A few still bore price tags from outdoor gear stores. Maria realized with growing horror that each compass represented someone who had walked this path before her. Hikers, hunters, perhaps even other experienced outdoors people who had trusted their instruments and ended up where? The path opened into a grove where a massive stone formation rose from the earth like an ancient altar. The stones weren't natural. They had been arranged in a perfect circle, each one carved with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in her flashlight beam. At the center of the circle lay a pile of bones, picked completely clean and bleached white by time and weather. Around the stone circle, hundreds more compasses hung from every available tree branch, creating a forest of metal instruments that clinked softly in the night breeze. All of their needles pointed to the center of the stone formation, where something dark and hungry waited beneath the accumulated bones. Maria's compass began vibrating so intensely it was difficult to hold. The brass grew hot against her palm, and she could hear a faint humming sound emanating from the instrument, or perhaps from all the compasses surrounding her. "Grandfather, what did you give me?" she whispered, understanding now that the compass had not been leading her to safety. It had been leading her here, to this place where something ancient fed on the offerings brought by magnetic needles and human curiosity. The bones in the center of the circle began to shift, and Maria realized they weren't just randomly scattered. They were arranged in a pattern, a compass rose made from human remains, with a skull at each cardinal point and smaller bones marking the degrees between. As she watched in fascination and terror, the bone compass began to rotate slowly, its macabre points turning to align with some magnetic force that had nothing to do with the Earth's poles. The humming sound grew louder, joined by the voices of all the other compasses in the grove, creating a metallic symphony that seemed to call to something deep beneath the stones. Maria tried to back away, but her feet wouldn't obey. Her grandfather's compass had become too hot to hold, yet she couldn't release it. The instrument was fused to her palm, drawing power from her life force to feed whatever ancient presence had turned Mistwood Forest into its hunting ground. She understood now that her grandfather had been here before, had made some bargain with the thing beneath the stones. The compass had been passed down through generations not as a gift, but as an obligation, a promise that each bearer would eventually find their way to this grove and add their bones to the ever-growing compass rose as the stone circle began to glow with an inner light, and something vast stirred beneath the arranged bones. Maria realized she would never leave Mistwood Forest. But in time, her compass would find its way to another unsuspecting hiker, guiding them through the darkness to join the collection of those who had trusted their instruments and found their way home to a place they never could have imagined. Last thing Maria saw before the stones opened was her own compass spinning one final time before pointing steadily toward the bone pile at her feet, welcoming her to take her place in the ancient pattern that had been drawing wanderers to their doom for longer than anyone could remember. David Chen had built his reputation photographing the abandoned and forgotten. derelict buildings, ghost towns, forgotten industrial sites that nature was slowly reclaiming. His work had been featured in horror magazines and gallery exhibitions, praised for capturing what critics called the beauty of decay. Grimwood Forest on Halloween night seemed like the perfect subject for his latest project. The ancient woods had a reputation among locals for being haunted, which David dismissed as small-town superstition. What interested him was the visual atmosphere: gnarled trees that looked like skeletal hands reaching toward the sky, ground fog that rolled between massive trunks like ghostly rivers, and the quality of light that filtered through the dense canopy. He'd chosen to work with his grandfather's vintage Leica camera, loaded with black and white film that would capture the grain and contrast impossible to achieve with digital equipment. There was something authentic about film photography, something that forced you to be deliberate with every shot, since you couldn't review your work until the film was developed. David spent 3 hours in the forest that first night, carefully composing shots of twisted branches silhouetted against the moon, fog-shrouded clearings, and the massive trunks of trees that had been growing since before the town was founded. He felt confident he'd captured some exceptional images. But when he developed the film in his home darkroom the next day, David discovered something that made his blood run cold. In every single photograph, there were figures standing among the trees that he had never seen through his viewfinder. Pale, elongated shapes that seemed to blend with the forest shadows, positioned just at the edge of the frame as if they'd been watching him work. In the first photo, a tall figure stood behind a massive oak, barely visible as a whitish smudge against the dark bark. By the middle of the roll, the figures were more distinct, humanoid but wrong, with limbs that seemed too long and features that didn't quite resolve into recognizable human characteristics. David studied the negatives under a magnifying glass, looking for evidence of double exposure or processing errors. But the figures were definitely there, embedded in the original film. Whatever had been watching him in Grimwood Forest had been real enough to be captured on silver halide emulsion. His first instinct was to dismiss the images as some kind of photographic anomaly, perhaps unusual lighting conditions or pareidolia, the tendency to see faces and figures in random patterns. But the shapes were too consistent, too deliberately positioned to be coincidental. Determined to solve the mystery, David returned to Grimwood the next night with more film and additional lighting equipment. This time he was methodical, studying each composition through his viewfinder for several minutes before taking the shot, scanning the forest around him for any movement or unusual shapes. He saw nothing out of the ordinary. The forest was quiet except for normal night sounds: wind in the branches, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of small animals moving through underbrush. His powerful LED panels lit up areas of forest that had been hidden in shadow during his first visit, revealing nothing more threatening than moss-covered logs and dense ferns. But when David developed the second roll of film, the figures were not only present, they were closer. The pale shapes had moved nearer to the camera in every shot, their features becoming more distinct and undeniably human-like, though stretched and distorted as if seen through a funhouse mirror. In several images, David could make out faces with hollow, dark sockets where eyes should be and mouths that hung open in expressions of hunger or desperation. The most disturbing photograph showed one of the figures standing directly behind where David remembered positioning himself. According to the camera's built-in light meter, the shot had been taken at 11:47 p.m. He remembered the exact moment because he'd felt an inexplicable chill run down his spine and had turned around to look behind him. He'd seen nothing at the time, but the photograph clearly showed a gaunt figure with elongated limbs reaching toward the camera with fingers that seemed to extend far beyond normal human proportions. David's rational mind insisted there had to be an explanation. Perhaps someone was playing an elaborate prank, using makeup and costumes to create the illusion of supernatural entities. But the figures moved too fluidly, appeared too consistently across multiple photographs taken from different angles and positions. Obsessed with documenting whatever phenomenon he'd discovered, David made a third trip to Grimwood Forest. This time he brought multiple cameras, his vintage Leica, a modern digital SLR for comparison, and even a cheap disposable camera as a control. He set up time-lapse photography equipment and positioned cameras with motion sensors at strategic points throughout the forest. If something was stalking him through the woods, he would capture definitive proof. David spent 4 hours methodically photographing the same areas where the figures had appeared, using every piece of equipment at his disposal. The motion-activated cameras triggered several times, but he could see nothing that would have set them off. His digital camera's LCD screen showed only empty forest scenes, normal and unremarkable. It was only when he was packing up his gear to leave that David realized he was no longer alone. They stood in a perfect circle around him, a dozen pale figures that hadn't been there moments before. In the harsh glare of his LED panels, he could see them clearly for the first time. They had once been human, but something had stretched them, elongated their limbs and faces until they resembled the distorted reflections he'd seen in his photographs. Their eyes were pools of darkness, and their mouths hung open as if they were trying to speak but had forgotten how. They moved with a fluid, otherworldly grace that suggested they were no longer bound by normal physical limitations. David raised his camera instinctively, but as he looked through the viewfinder, he saw something that stopped his heart. In the ground glass focusing screen, he could see his own reflection, but it wasn't quite right. His face appeared elongated, stretched, his eyes beginning to take on the same hollow darkness as the figures surrounding him. The camera fell from his hands as David realized the horrible truth. The figures weren't supernatural entities haunting Grimwood Forest. They were photographers, hikers, curious visitors who had gotten too close to something ancient and hungry that lived among the trees. Something that transformed those it captured, stretching them into new shapes while keeping them aware of what they had become. As the pale figures closed in around him, David understood that his photographs had never been documenting ghosts or spirits. They had been capturing the moment of his own transformation, showing him glimpses of what he was becoming with each visit to the forest. The search teams found David's cameras 3 days later, scattered throughout Grimwood Forest along with his other equipment. The film from his vintage Leica was ruined, spoiled by what investigators assumed was moisture damage. His digital cameras contained only normal forest photography, trees, shadows, the occasional night bird. But visitors to Grimwood Forest still report strange experiences, especially photographers who work there after dark. They develop their film to find pale figures watching from the shadows, always just at the edge of the frame, as if something in the forest is studying them with the same intensity they bring to capturing the perfect shot. And sometimes, if they look closely enough at their photographs, they can see their own faces beginning to change, elongating and stretching as they become part of the ancient collection that dwells forever in the dark heart of Grimwood Forest. The legend of the Weeping Willow had been part of Millfield's Halloween folklore for as long as anyone could remember. According to local stories, a massive willow tree deep in Darkwater Forest shed real tears every Halloween night, crying for some long-lost tragedy that the townspeople had mythologized into a dozen different versions. 16-year-old Lisa Chang had grown up hearing the stories and dismissing them as small-town nonsense designed to keep teenagers from wandering into the forest after dark. But when her friends dared her to find the crying tree as part of their Halloween night ritual, Lisa saw it as an opportunity to prove that she was braver than the superstitious locals who still believed in ghost stories. Armed with her phone's flashlight and a portable speaker to live stream her adventure on social media, Lisa entered Darkwater Forest just after midnight, following the old hunting trail that local legend claimed led to the Weeping Tree. The forest was eerily quiet, with none of the usual night sounds Lisa had expected. No owl calls, no rustling of small animals, not even the whisper of wind through the branches. The silence was so complete it seemed almost oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. After 30 minutes of hiking, Lisa heard it, a sound that made her skin crawl and her confident skepticism begin to waver. It was sobbing, unmistakably human but muffled and distant, as if someone were crying deep inside a cave or buried beneath the earth. "Okay, guys," she whispered into her phone's camera, trying to maintain her composure for her viewers. "I'm definitely hearing something weird out here. But there's got to be a rational explanation, right? Maybe it's just wind through the trees or some kind of animal call I'm not familiar with." But even as she spoke, Lisa knew the sound was neither wind nor animal. It was a woman crying with the kind of desperate grief that spoke of profound loss and endless suffering. Following the sound through increasingly dense forest, Lisa eventually came upon a clearing dominated by an enormous willow tree. The ancient tree was massive, its drooping branches creating a natural cathedral that blocked out the moonlight. But what made Lisa's breath catch in her throat was the tree's bark. It was weeping. Clear, viscous liquid seeped from the bark in dozens of places, forming rivulets that ran down the trunk like tears on a face. The substance caught the light from Lisa's phone, glistening as it dripped steadily onto the ground below. Holy shit, Lisa breathed, forgetting she was live streaming. The tree is actually crying. There's some kind of, sap or something coming out of the bark. But as she approached closer, Lisa realized the liquid wasn't sap. It was too clear, too much like actual tears, and it was falling in a rhythm that matched the sobbing sounds, as if the tree itself were crying. The sound was definitely coming from inside the massive trunk. Lisa pressed her ear against the bark and could hear it clearly, a woman's voice, muffled but unmistakably human, weeping with endless sorrow. When Lisa placed her palm against the bark, she felt something that nearly made her scream. There was a heartbeat pulsing beneath her hand, slow and steady like the pulse of something impossibly large. The tree wasn't just crying, it was alive in a way that trees shouldn't be. "Hello?" Lisa called out, feeling foolish but unable to ignore the obviously human sounds. "Is someone there? Are you hurt?" The sobbing stopped abruptly, replaced by what sounded like whispered words too muffled to understand. Lisa pressed her ear against the bark again and made out fragments of speech. "Help me. Trapped so long. Find my baby. Please help." Lisa pulled back, her heart racing. According to local records she'd researched for her debunking video, a woman named Catherine Mills had disappeared in these woods 50 years ago while searching for her lost child. Her body was never found, though searchers had combed every inch of darkwater forest. "Catherine?" Lisa whispered to the tree. "Catherine Mills? Is that you?" The response was immediate and heartbreaking, a cry of recognition and hope that seemed to come from deep within the massive trunk. "Yes. Oh God, yes. You can hear me? I've been calling for so long. 50 years trapped in this horrible place. Please, you have to help me find my son. He's lost somewhere in the forest, and I can't leave to look for him. I'm bound to this tree, trapped inside it. But if you could just..." "This is impossible," Lisa said, backing away from the tree. "Trees don't trap people. There has to be some other explanation." But even as she spoke, the bark where she'd been standing began to soften and pulse like living flesh. The weeping intensified and Catherine's voice became more desperate. "Don't leave me. Please, you're the first person who's been able to hear me clearly. The others just run away when they hear the crying. But you're different, you believe me, don't you?" Lisa wanted to run, wanted to dismiss this as some kind of hallucination or elaborate hoax. But the voice was so human, so filled with genuine anguish, that she found herself staying despite every instinct screaming at her to flee. "How did you get trapped in there?" Lisa asked. "I don't remember exactly," Catherine's voice replied, muffled by the thick bark. "I was looking for Tommy, my little boy. He wandered off during a family camping trip, and I went into the forest to find him. I must have gotten lost, ended up here. The tree called to me, promised it could help me find Tommy if I just came closer." The bark began to ripple and shift, forming vague impressions of a human face, eyes, nose, mouth pressed against the inside of the trunk as if someone were trapped just beneath the surface. The next thing I knew, I was inside, part of the tree but still conscious. I can see through its roots, feel everything that happens in the forest. I've been searching for Tommy all these years, calling out to him, but I can't leave. I need someone to help me, someone to find my son so I can finally rest. Lisa's phone buzzed with notifications from her live stream viewers, but she ignored them. Whether this was real or some kind of psychological break, she felt compelled to help. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. "Find Tommy," Catherine pleaded. "He's still here in the forest, still lost after all these years. The tree showed me. Time works differently here. He's waiting for me somewhere deeper in the woods, but I can't reach him while I'm trapped." Lisa began to understand the horrible truth. If Catherine had been searching for 50 years and still hadn't found her son, it meant Tommy was trapped too, somewhere in Darkwater Forest, preserved by the same supernatural forces that had bound his mother to the weeping willow. As Lisa ventured deeper into the forest, following Catherine's whispered directions, she found herself walking into a trap that had been set decades ago. The crying tree was just the beginning. Somewhere in the dark heart of these woods, a lost little boy was still calling for his mother, and the forest had been patiently waiting for someone compassionate enough to try to reunite them. By the time Lisa realized that Catherine and Tommy were both part of something larger and hungrier than she could imagine, it was too late to escape. The forest had claimed another helper, another voice to add to its collection of the lost and the searching. Her phone's live stream ended abruptly as Lisa disappeared into the darkness, but not before her viewers heard her voice join the others, a new cry for help echoing through Darkwater Forest, calling out to the next person brave enough to answer, calling out to the next person brave enough to answer. Night shift security guard Tom Mitchell had been patrolling the perimeter of Thornvale Forest Reserve for 8 months, and the job had been exactly as boring as he'd expected. His duties consisted of walking a 3-mile loop around the forest's edge, checking for vandalism, illegal camping, and the occasional drunk teenager looking for a place to party. But in the past 2 weeks, Tom had begun to notice movement in the treetops that didn't match any wildlife behavior he'd ever seen. It started with glimpses of motion in his peripheral vision, shapes that seemed too large and too coordinated to be squirrels or birds. When he'd turn his flashlight toward the source, he'd sometimes catch the reflection of eyes looking back at him from high in the canopy, positioned at a height that should have been impossible for most forest animals to reach. The first few times, Tom convinced himself he was seeing raccoons or opossums, but the eyes were wrong, too large, too close together, and they reflected his light with an intensity that made his skin crawl. More disturbing was their behavior. Instead of fleeing when illuminated, they simply stared back at him with what appeared to be intelligent interest. Just animals, he told himself during his nightly rounds. Nothing to worry about, but the eyes multiplied nightly, spreading throughout more trees, and Tom began to notice they were arranged in clusters that suggested they weren't individual creatures but groups of something working together with disturbing coordination. When Tom mentioned his observations to his supervisor, he was told that Thornvale was home to many nocturnal species and that his job was to patrol the forest's perimeter, not conduct wildlife surveys. The dismissive response only made Tom more determined to understand what he was seeing. He began bringing binoculars to work, studying the treetops more carefully during his rounds. What he discovered made him wish he'd left well enough alone. The shapes in the canopy were definitely not any known forest animal. They were humanoid but elongated, with limbs that seemed to bend in ways human joints shouldn't allow. They moved through the trees with fluid grace, swinging from branch to branch without ever seeming to touch the ground. Most disturbing was their behavior. They weren't foraging or hunting like normal animals. They were watching him, tracking his movement as he walked his patrol route, positioned at strategic points that gave them clear sight lines to his position. Tom realized he was being studied. The watchers showed remarkable patience, never approaching, never making sounds that would reveal their presence to casual observation. They simply observed him night after night, learning his patterns, his schedule, his habits. Tom began varying his patrol route, taking different paths and changing his timing. But the watchers adapted quickly, repositioning themselves to maintain visual contact no matter which route he chose. It was clear they possessed intelligence far beyond what any forest animal should have. On Halloween night, Tom's flashlight died 20 minutes into his shift, leaving him in complete darkness along the forest perimeter. His backup flashlight was in his truck a quarter-mile away, and protocol required him to complete his patrol regardless of equipment failures. As Tom's eyes adjusted to the darkness, he realized the watchers had descended from the trees. They surrounded him in a loose circle, their pale forms barely visible in the faint moonlight filtering through the canopy. Up close, he could see they had once been human, or at least humanoid, but something had changed them, stretched them into new configurations that allowed them to live in the treetops like some kind of arboreal society. Their faces were gaunt and elongated, their eyes large and adapted for night vision. Their limbs were disproportionately long, ending in fingers that seemed designed for gripping branches rather than manipulating tools. They moved with the fluid coordination of a pack, but their intelligence was unmistakably human. Tom tried to back away, but found his path blocked by more of the creatures. They had planned this encounter carefully, waiting for the perfect moment when he would be vulnerable and isolated. "What do you want?" Tom whispered, his voice barely audible. The nearest creature tilted its head, studying him with obvious intelligence. When it spoke, its voice was barely human, a whisper that sounded like wind through leaves. "You've been watching us," it said. "Now we watch you." Tom realized that the Watchers hadn't been studying him out of curiosity or territorial behavior. They had been evaluating him, determining whether he would make a suitable addition to their canopy community. "We were like you once," another voice whispered from the darkness. "Security guards, hikers, people who spent too much time in the forest alone. The trees called to us, showed us a better way to live." As Tom looked around the circle of elongated figures, he began to understand that they weren't supernatural entities or mutated animals. They were people who had chosen, or been chosen, to join something ancient that lived in the high branches of Thornvale Forest. Something that transformed those it claimed into creatures perfectly adapted for an arboreal existence. "The forest needs watchers," a third voice explained. "Guardians who can see everything from above, who can move through the canopy without being detected. You've proven yourself observant, patient. You would make an excellent addition to our community." Tom felt a strange tingling in his limbs, as if his bones were beginning to stretch and reshape. The transformation was already starting, his body responding to some influence that radiated from the creatures around him. "Don't fight it," they whispered in unison. "It only hurts if you resist. Soon you'll see the world from a new perspective, understand the forest as we do. You'll never be lonely again." As Tom's consciousness began to fade and his body started its metamorphosis into something designed for life in the treetops, he understood that the Watchers hadn't been studying him as prey. They had been recruiting him, adding him to a community of observers who kept eternal vigil over Thornvale Forest from their hidden perches in the canopy. The next morning, search teams found Tom's abandoned security truck and equipment, but no trace of the guard himself. His replacement was hired within a week, and soon began reporting strange movement in the treetops during his nightly patrols. But Tom was still there, watching from high above with eyes adapted for darkness, learning the patience of the trees and the ancient wisdom of those who had chosen to live between earth and sky. He had joined the Watchers in their eternal vigil, and soon he would help them evaluate whether his replacement would make a suitable addition to their ever-growing community in the canopy of Thornvale Forest. Thornvale Forest,